That time, my DMing style ended a marriage. While it is technically true, the title is a bit of a joking hyperbole. So here's the details. I was DMing a heavily modified 5e campaign over Discord. The players in the story were me, the DM, the wizard, who was technically the match that started the trash fire, the husband, who I believe was playing a druid, the wife, who was playing a bard, and the ranger, who was there but not involved. The campaign setup was that the party was hired by a Grand Duke to explore the wilderness of a newly discovered continent and establish a settlement on behalf of the kingdom. It was a highly sandboxy game that used a lot of settlement building and exploration rules that I homebrewed for the game. Well, of course you had to homebrew those rules. I did too. And for anyone who's ever popped up any D&D books, you'd know that 5th edition D&D doesn't really have any exploration rules that are worth using, as half of them are just, I don't know, how would you run it? Followed by 20 flocking navigation checks and checking for exhaustion. The worst rule in the game. And then if one of your players is a ranger, they just ignore all of that anyway. But what am I saying? I'm sure this 5.5 thing, or whatever Wizards of the Coast is going to call it now, is going to fix these rules and knock it out of the park. But for their sakes, I hope they do it before Daggerheart and the other half-dozen D&DS fantasy tabletop RPGs drop. But before then, they're fine. Anyway, back to the story. Everything was going well. Until at one point during session 9 or 10, Wizard asked the group, "Do we want to explore the new wilderness region, or focus on improving the settlement first?" Husband wanted to build the settlement first, and wife wanted to explore. They then began to argue very publicly about it on the Discord. My big failing was not ending the session immediately. But in my defense, it was hard to tell the argument was out of character, and not just a debate about what to do, until it was way too late. I kept trying to get the reins again, but husband was talking about wife's not prioritizing things in life properly, and wife kept saying husband was always like this. I decided to end the session early. Literally only got 30 minutes in, when we typically play for 3 to 4 hours. But the damage was done. The day of the following discussion, I received messages from both husband and wife saying that they had been fighting about this literally all week, and were going to be getting a divorce. They both said they didn't want to play with the other, and had decided to leave the campaign so everyone else could play. At this point, the party was cut in half, and the game soon petered out. I know that they obviously had a lot of issues outside of the game, but it is still weird that it was my game that was the straw that broke the camel's back. From time to time, when I'm hanging out with my D&D friends, we still bring up that time my DMing was so bad, it destroyed a marriage. Look, OP, I wouldn't be too hard on yourself. Just for these little snippets of dialogue you provided, I think if it wasn't the base building, it would be not getting enough help in a fight, or cleaning the mess kits after camp, or not using sending stones to call your parents more often, or why they don't take each other out to any nice dungeons anymore. But at least now you've become experienced in relationship-ruining games like Dungeons and Divorce. Perhaps you could learn more games in that genre, like Powered by the Ashley Madison Account, Legend of the 5 Cell Phones, or my personal favorite, My Kids on Bikes Going to Her House for the Indefinite Future with no visitation rights. Karen,
You're a heartless bunch, and I hope you die.
My name is Jacob Crowe, and welcome to the Crowe's Perch. We're in between OSRing my PBTA, which I'm pretty sure means I have advantage when Mew-maxing. I tell tales of terrible tabletop tragedies. And so, without further ado, let's gather up a murder and dive into this next story. I joined a Pathfinder 2e game, starting at 11th level, with a free archetype and ancestry paragon. It was a homebrew setting. We had to help the fairy summer court against spring, autumn, and winter. I created an archer fighter. We were entitled to an 11th level item. I picked up +2 resilient explorer's clothing. I spent 2,850 gold pieces on a +2 striking longbow, with astral and flaming runes, and a greater phantasmal doorknob. During the first 2 sessions, no player character ever rolled a critical failure on an attack roll, in part due to hero points, while I am fairly certain that some enemies did. In the middle of the third session, an ancient white dragon attacked a festival from the sky. I acted first and launched a felling strike, critical hit. The dragon's flight was shut down. The flaming rune generated persistent damage that would constantly trigger its fire weakness 15, and the greater phantasmal doorknob automatically blinded it. It was epic and satisfying. I used my final action on a vanilla longbow strike. Due to a natural 5 and a -5 multi-attack penalty, I rolled a critical failure. I elected against re-rolling it with a hero point because it was not worth it. The GM declared that my character accidentally broke their entire magic bow. The GM read that dry firing a bow breaks it, forgetting to knock an arrow, and thus dry firing the bow seems like something that would happen on a critical failure. I protested. I said that this was arbitrary and unfair, that it would be patently absurd for a master archer to commit such a mistake, and that enemies previously rolled critical failures on attacks to no ill effect. The GM replied by saying that RPGs are about telling interesting stories, and that highs need to be balanced out by lows. The GM said that the rules empower the GM to declare what happens on a critical failure, and no, this is not quite right. I protested further, but the GM either booted me from the Discord server or deleted it outright. How could this have been better handled? Okay, before I answer this question, I need to untangle this and say something from my chest. I dislike both the OP and the DM here for a few reasons, especially with the way the OP framed this story. I'm sorry, but all I'm seeing here are numbers and proc chances, and it feels like I'm reading someone's retelling of a raid in Final Fantasy XIV as opposed to a tabletop game. The player here gives me the ick, okay? Real min-maxy vibes. But I do agree that the game master went way too far with just outright breaking their bow. Does it make sense that the bow broke on a dry fire? I mean, kinda. But that's up for them to decide if that's a suitable consequence. And yes, the player is allowed to dispute that if they feel like it's not fair. Which, I agree. It's not fair. The GM should have talked about this ruling before the game even started. Now, what I don't like is the framing upon which this player has decided to make this argument, being on the basis of the rules and not the ruling the GM has decided on. Saying, that's not how that works. I'm sorry, buddy. As Rule 1 in nearly every tabletop game goes, and this goes for Pathfinder 2nd Edition as well, that the GM can change any one of these rules if they want to. Granted that I would hope that any changes are agreed upon beforehand, but there are some rulings that are so ingrained with how a GM plays their game that they might not be readily apparent. And I get it, I totally understand that not everyone likes things like critical fail effects, and this game master clearly didn't apply them evenly across the board. That is completely on them, and I'm totally on the OP side on this point. Consistency is really important to your rulings, as it can cause severe confusion with players when a rule is suddenly enforced that wasn't before, or if a rule feels like it pops out of nowhere. So with all that being said, to answer the OP's question, how couldn't you have handled it better? Because it sounds like you two didn't handle anything at all. The two of you never identified the central problem you're having. You're talking past each other, where the game master's talking about narrative, and you seem preoccupied with the system. You need to find common ground and communicate what kinds of expectations that you both have for this game, and come up with some compromises. Now, unfortunately, Paizo didn't print a talk to each other like flocking adults rule in the book, so there really isn't an easy way to— Wait a second. Oh, never mind. There it is. Oh, come on. Like half of you didn't immediately skip to character creation. Anyway, point is, you're not going to find your answer to proper communication in a feat tree, but in an open dialogue with your game master. If you don't find a way to open up that communication, you're better off finding another game. Because beyond rules and systems and dice rolls, that's what tabletop RPGs are at their heart. A conversation. Content warning for misogyny, sexual harassment, and PDF-philia. Viewer discretion is advised. Hey y'all. First post here, and hopefully my last. No offense. I've got a Call of Cthulhu themed one for y'all. So around 6 months ago, I joined Roll20 to look for games, since I live in nowhere, middle of USA. I originally joined to find Vampire the Masquerade games. But nobody plays Vampire the Masquerade on Roll20, at least on the free games. I instead started looking at Call of Cthulhu games. as I had recently gotten to the game through Chaosium's Bookshops of Arkham live play series, which is fantastic and I highly recommend. There were a couple games I showed interest in, but only one actually got back to me. This is where I met the lore keeper, Call of Cthulhu's name for Dungeon Master, of the game, and the central character of this post, Stan. Names have been changed. Stan was a character. He had apparently been lore keeping for the past 27 years. He had a weird sense of humor, and the strangest thing about him was that he had a wife and a child. I still, to this day, do not know how. He also streamed all of his Call of Cthulhu games on YouTube, and they're probably still out there. He ran a weekly game on Thursday nights that fit into my schedule perfectly, and I was excited but nervous to join. It was my first time playing a tabletop RPG with strangers, and I wasn't sure how I would measure up, so to speak. Stan assured me that, though his games were designed to be challenging, he was welcoming to new players interested in Call of Cthulhu. So, Thursday rolled around, and we started our game. No Session 0 or anything. It was just me and two other people, who we'll call Mark and John. The story was honestly kinda interesting. Our characters awoke in the lobby of a hotel, with no knowledge of how we got there. The premise was of an ever-expanding hotel, where you could order anything from room service. The payment, however, was your life in years. And we had racked up a substantial debt. Think of the Lotus Casino from Percy Jackson. Now, the first red flag came in the second session of this campaign. Our characters, both male, were going to bed for the night, and were being offered the hotel's standard accommodations: food, alcohol, cards to play games with, the standard lot. Then he offered some womanly company. Yeah, he was offering our characters sex workers, deciding it wasn't really in character. But Mark accepted, expecting just a fade to black. Stan then goes into detail about the girl's strip routine, and begins to describe them approaching Mark's character on the bed, before we stop him. I thought it was weird, but I brushed it off and told myself that it was fine. This game is more adult than your average D&D game. And besides, Stan stopped when we voiced our uncomfortableness. So, he must be a good guy, right? A couple months passed without real incident. Our characters died escaping the hotel. Mark's actually died falling down the stairs. He ended up leaving after this. Not sure if it was because of this, though. And we started a new mini-campaign. We picked up a couple players along the way, including one who I'll call Charlie, and another I'll call Aaron. This campaign was a bit more unoriginal. A town goes crazy, and everyone starts killing each other. But whatever, we could have fun with this. The campaign is going fine so far. I'm playing a female nurse who was raised in an ideal childhood, and is, quote-unquote, too precious for this world. John's character, being played by Stan, since John couldn't make it to the session, fumbled a persuasion check, and bit off the end of his tongue as punishment. He put on this annoying voice to signify this, and was nigh incomprehensible at times. So we decided to try and fix it. Both me and Charlie's characters were nurses, so we thought it would be easy. For some reason, though, Stan decided that Aaron's character wouldn't want his tongue, which he bit so hard it split, fixed. We had a lengthy debate trying to get his tongue fixed, until eventually I decided to roll persuasion. I fumbled it, and was to receive my punishment. Maybe I'll bite my tongue and have to do a stupid voice like him, I thought. Maybe he'll just make the existing injury worse. No. Instead, Stan launches into a detailed explanation of how my character receives a traumatic flashback from the time her dad beat her and roped her mother, repeatedly. Reminder, this was not a part of her character at all. He just decided it was, though. It was a serious breach of player agency, and also just fucked up. I was decently uncomfortable now, but I didn't say anything, because again, I thought that might have been normal for Call of Cthulhu. So anyway, we finished the campaign. Something about the cat goddess Bast making people go crazy. We defeat her by blowing her up with a wheelbarrow full of dynamite. A week passes, and Stan immediately launches into the next campaign. And little did I know, this campaign would be the last. So this is absolutely deranged, and this is about when a player should do what I said earlier and leave the table after telling the GM what the fuck is wrong with you. Situations like this in particular, like intentionally picking up players new to a game and barraging them with descriptions of something like sexual assault, is particularly heinous to me. Oh, my last group left because I kept doing freak shit like this, so I'm just gonna keep doing it to people that won't immediately call me out on it. Like, come the flock on, dude. Yeah, sorry for slipping into chuckles a bit for that. I don't know what happened. I've had nothing but League of Adventures shorts in my recommended feed, and I'm beginning to think I have a problem. Anyway, let's shake all the wacky out now because I just skipped ahead of this story, and dear lord, it gets really bad. So remember the rest of those content warnings, because they're going to be coming up right now. So let's get back to it. Our characters were approached by a guy named Tom to go on an expedition to Argentina to look for rare artifacts at a dig site. The only way to get there was by boat, however, because I guess planes weren't invented in the 1930s. Whatever. And the very first thing that Stan mentions is how excited the sailors are to finally be around a woman again. Specifically how horny they were. Okay, fine, whatever. This kind of thing was normal for Stan at this point, and it never seemed to reflect his attitude towards real women. We get to Argentina, and decide to explore the city of Buenos Aires, and the very first thing that happens is we see some random woman get stabbed to death and take sanity damage. Why? Who knows? We didn't roll poorly or anything. It just happened. I'm still not sure why it happened. I was planning on talking to Stan after the game at this point, but he exited the call before I could, and I forgot about it by the next day. I missed the next week, but apparently we got a new person before she dropped out an hour into it. She said she found a better game that fits her schedule, but Stan was apparently talking about how some people just can't handle my games. And then, the final session happened. It's almost like he took her leaving as a challenge to see how far his game could go. So, in the campaign, eldritch bullshit happens, and our characters are transported to a world not our own. Our only lead is Tom, the guy who led us on the expedition, who's now the mayor of Arkham, Massachusetts, a big place in the Call of Cthulhu mythos. We track down his office and ring up the receptionist to make appointment. She tells us it'll be a bit of a wait, so we decide to do a bit of snooping while we wait. Charlie's, who was absent at the time, character, and my character distract the receptionist while Aaron's character snoops around, finding a pair of double doors. He passes a roll to peek inside, and Stan says this. You see a child, his legs draped over the desk at the back of the room. He's crying. In front of him is some sort of creature with tons of tentacles. You can imagine what our thoughts were. We wanted nothing of the sort to happen, so we burst through the door. Me and Charlie were there suddenly. Again, not the best DM. And the child was fine. He was sitting on the lap of the mayor and smiling. Something was still off though, and I didn't like the implications of molestation, but it got worse. The child passes my character, and Stan asks for a spot hidden roll. Hard success, I say. The child is walking funny, he replies. I was going to have some choice words with him. We finished up the mini-campaign, and before I can say anything, he launches into the next one. There was about an hour before the session was set to end, and I guess he thought we could just start a new one. This one had us approach to take an expedition to a foreign country to look for something. Okay, already I'm pretty pissed with him, but I rolled up a new character. I basically made Lara Croft from Tomb Raider in the 1920s. We were traveling by boat again, and he starts the same horny sailors shtick again, but this time directed at my character. I'm not having any of it though. So my character tells the sailors that she'd cut off their balls if they looked at her wrong. Violent. But I thought it would not only send a message to the sailors, but also to Stan, that I wasn't enjoying this. He has one of the sailors come up to my character and tell her, "You know, the trip's gonna be dangerous. You might die." Why not have a little fun before you die, huh? I have my character turn to errands and ask him for protection from these assholes, and he agrees. With that, the session ends, and I'm pretty pissed. I play tabletop RPGs to get away from real shit. I don't want to have to deal with sexual harassment and children in them. How could a man with a wife and child think either of those were okay? It's important to note, at no point did Stan ever ask us if we were okay with this, or even signify that this would happen. Not in his rules, not in his Roll20 post, and certainly never in person. It was clear that he was just doing the harassment bit as a joke, and the child rope thing was certainly for shock value. But that didn't make it okay. It made it almost worse, in fact, because it showed that he clearly didn't treat these things with the care and respect needed to portray them. It was just a game to him. We had a lengthy talk with Stan after the session, and his response to our uncomfortableness was, "That's the way I've always run it," which doesn't make it okay by any stretch of the matter. We, after informing Charlie of the incident, decided to draft up our complaints with him and see what he had to say for himself. If he responded with an apology and a promise to grow, we'd stay. Anything else, we were out of there. He responded by saying the same thing as before, that it was always the way I've ran it. So, we left. Me, Charlie, Aaron, and John have since started our own game nights together, where I run Vampire the Masquerade and Charlie runs Call of Cthulhu. We've been away from Stan for about a month now, and I think we're better for it. Charlie's honestly a better DM than Stan ever was, and I'm getting more confident in my DMing skills. Stan's Roll20 game has since disappeared, and he hasn't streamed since then. So I guess he gave up on looking for new people to play with. Or maybe he never started. Who knows? Who cares? So yeah, TLDR, Lore Keeper injects aspects of harassment, misogyny, and pedophilia into his games for entertainment. Loses all of his players. I am equally as baffled as the OP here, that Stan has a wife and child, and feels comfortable showcasing child sexual harassment, and a bunch of other words I have to play a Roblox sound over in order to even talk about on YouTube. Something tells me that he played some weird Call of Cthulhu games in the past, and just picked up whatever he was taught and passed it down when he started GMing. I personally would have brought all of this up to the table much sooner, but hindsight's 2020, and according to the comment section, the OP of this story had issues with confronting them, which I totally understand, and I can kinda see where they may have gotten thrown off, especially when it came to Charlie, where the OP says in the comment section that Stan never directed any of the weird harassment in-game to her out of the game. It's just so weird to me that Stan contained all of this solely within the context of the game, never spilling out, all the while being an absolute freak when he got behind the DMing screen. You could say something like the misogyny in his Call of Cthulhu game would make sense in the historical context of the setting, but you can also, as a player, say, I just don't want to deal with that. That's completely fine. And there are even game systems in historical settings like Vaesen that even go so far as to mention as such in their rulebooks. But the child stuff, I want to say things to Stan that would get me demonetized. And so I'm just gonna let you load in the shells, fill in the blanks with that one. You do not implement something like that in your games without your players getting at least a little bit of a heads up. But that is going to be it for today's stories. And if you like these stories and would like to see more of them, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Made it this far? Why not leave a comment? Can't think of a comment? Then leave the comment, Dungeons and Divorce. So that way I know you made it to the end of today's video. And I do read those comments. I heart them sometimes too. Do you want a heart? Maybe leave that comment, But if you want to further support the channel, then please consider signing up in the Crow's Perch Patreon. Link in the description down below, so that you too can join up with birds like our Counts of Quills, like Fairyfire, Just Monica, Shepdog, Evix, King Drazil, Christian Pip, Haley Thompson, Zero Fang, and Netscape Navigator. But if you're crazy enough to pay $5 instead, then you could become a Baron of Beaks. I told you I'd bring the voice back. The voice? What was it, some kind of Dune reference? Lisana Gaib as it was written? Like Spooky, Archangel Noriko, Keone, Jonathan Fenton, Miss Tiger Beans, Kieran Slater, Running Bear, Haley McAuliffe, Brittany Mars, Lady Spectra, Ars Torak, The School Bus, Kutos Weasel, Carter Spawn, Lord Rend, Den of the Drake, McYeatley, and Anya.
The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. For we live in a placid isle of birds, in the midst of black seas of feathers, and it was not meant that we should voyage far, unless, of course, you are Duke of Feathers. Like Repetitive Debug, Xenocruise, Angrad, Grunt, Kive Mind, Jarrett Sewer, and Matthew Mulqueeny, signing off.
And with all of that out of the way, I shall see you next time as the crow flies.